Hi, everybody. Welcome. With us today is Barbara Kelly. She's the CEO and President of Caltech PBIS. She is presenting the second in a series of 3 webinars, Effective Use of Data to Address Equity Issues in PBIS. The first webinar was on March 18th. It was called Effective Use of Data for School-Wide Decision-Making in PBIS. That should now be archived. So after the session, I'll send an email to all the participants with a link to that webinar. Also, mark your calendars for the webinar number 3. That's Thursday, May 14th at 3 p.m. Or is it 3:30? Oh, I think it's 3:30. We'll talk about it later. This one will focus on using data for intensive or Tier 3 interventions. Okay, the goals for the today's webinar are to learn data-based inquiry processes to understand and address issues of equity, and to learn from each other in understanding and addressing school climate issues. Let me go through the agenda. Our focus today is on identifying and addressing equity issues. Reminder, this is an opportunity for you to interact with your colleagues and to tap into Barbara's expertise. Please type your questions and comments or links to any resources that you may have in the chat area. We get the best information from you all when you add your thoughts in the chat area. We will pause during the presentation for questions. I'll be sometimes interrupting Barbara if you have chat questions, and so we can answer them right away. We'd like to keep it as conversational as possible.
So we'll get started. Welcome everybody this afternoon, and we are trying to figure out how to make this conversational, so we're going to rely on what you write in the chat room to give us a hint for when we might want to have a little bit of a two-way conversation so that I don't just kind of run through this. We're really going to talk about equity, and we have a short period of time that we're together today, so we're really not going to be creating experts on disproportionality, and I'm far from considering myself an expert on that topic either. But we're really going to talk about how we can build a working knowledge about looking at data by ethnicity and begin to build equity within our environmental practices. So we're really going to be looking at how we can analyze discipline data for disproportionality so that it allows school teams to be able to evaluate and to adjust their current systems and practices so that they can so they can provide proper support that might promote success now for all students. So we want to make sure that we're taking a look at all the different ethnicities within our schools. Part of this is because we know that that relationship between the student and school is really critical for success. As students are really moved from the classroom at higher rates than their peers, then that relationship between the student and the school is significantly weakened, and that study is up there for you, and it is across all grade levels. We also want to talk about making sure that we're disaggregating office discipline referral into our racial and ethnic minority groups. So it's not just that we're collecting our office referral, but we want to break them into the groups so that we can examine the data and assess the level either of proportionality or of disproportionality that may affect some of our student outcomes. So we might see a good trend in our student outcomes, but until we look at that trend within the different ethnic groups, we really don't have the full story so that we can do some of that planning and monitoring of the practices that we put into place. Overrepresentation of minority students in a school's discipline data may indicate that a school's current systems and practices are really not meeting the needs of all of the minority students. So such an analysis really assists school teams as they assess and modify their current systems and practices so that they can better support all of their students. So really to ensure an equitable education for all of our students, there really exists a need for us to review that outcome data of the various racial and ethnic groups. Overrepresentation of minority students and a school's discipline data really may indicate that a school's current systems and practices are not meeting the needs of their minority groups. So the main idea here is that evaluating discipline data among ethnic groups is a way for schools to work towards improved student outcomes for all students. Before we get started, it would be good for us to review a few of the key words that people use when we're talking about looking at equity in education. Most of these are going to sound familiar and you're going to be aware of what they are. So overrepresentation is obvious, excuse me, and then the idea of what something is disproportionate, meaning that it's unequal. The risk index might be something that's new to some of you and maybe some data that you're not collecting. And it's the proportion of a group that is at risk of a particular outcome. So I'm going to talk about that more as we go through this presentation. Then there's also the risk ratio, and that's the relative risk of a target group compared with the risk of a comparison group. So we'll look at the risk ratio between ethnicities. We're also going to be talking about that word culturally relevant, which is what we're really hoping that our practices are, that we're using culturally relevant practices with our kids. And that's really about the model that addresses student achievement and helps students to accept and affirm their cultural identity. Cultural responsiveness is really the synergetic relationship between home and community culture and the school culture. I wanted to say synergy, and I couldn't get synergetic wrapped around. One of the outcomes with PBIS schools is really to improve the social competence of our students, and we do that by taking a look at our systems. So when we're looking at our systems, it's what do we have in place that's going to support our staff when they're working with diverse populations. We also want to go back and evaluate our practices. How is PBS being implemented to support all students? This is where we're looking for that culturally relevant curriculum. And then data. What data do we have? What tools do we have to collect and summarize that data? I'm going to propose to you today a three-point perspective when you go to take a look at that data. When we're talking about school ethnicity reports, the kind of data that we would like to collect, it's 3 points. The first one being, we want to look at the percentage of enrolled students compared to the percentage of office discipline referrals received by each ethnic racial group. So these are the referrals by ethnicity. So now we're comparing students to referrals. The second data point is the percentage of all enrolled students compared to the percentage of students from each group with referrals. So now it's students with referrals and then referrals by ethnicity. So we're looking now students to students within each group. The third data point is the percentage of students within each racial ethnic group with referrals, and this is commonly referred to as the referral risk index. So we're going to take a look at each one of these in more detail so that you can understand them a little clearer. So the first one was the referrals by ethnicity. This is really where we're talking about what's the piece of a certain ethnic group of the whole pie of referrals. So it compares the percent of total referrals an ethnic group has compared to the percent of total school population that ethnic group comprises. So really, what does this do for us is it helps us evaluate whether a certain group has a disproportionate percentage of referrals compared to what percentage of the total school population the same ethnicity group composes. It's pretty much of a mouthful, but what data points we're looking at for this would be what percent of the total school population is this ethnicity group, and then we would compare it to what percent of the total referrals does this ethnicity group have. So I'm going to show you an example. Sometimes when you tell a story, these numbers are a little bit easier to understand. I'm going to zoom in on this slide and really talk about how you would read this information so that you can hear the story behind these numbers. And you'll be able to see on the left there's a chart with referrals, or a graph with the referrals by ethnicity, and you can tell just by looking at it that there's a bit of disproportionality when you're taking a look at the Latino on this one. And so we're going to follow that story through. There are 123 Latino students enrolled in this school, and they make up 24.6% of the school's total population. So there are 191 referrals that came from Latino students, and it counts for 28.68% of the school's total referrals. So you can see there's a little bit of disproportionality there. In comparison, we can take a look at there are 225 white students enrolled in the school, and they make up 51% of the school's total population. With 337 referrals from the white students, it accounts for 50.6% of the school's total referrals. So you can see across the bottom is the white, and this is what we're comparing it to. Okay, so on the bottom row is where the white is when you take a look at the chart, and the Latino is the one that is the fourth one down. And look across, and you can see the percent enrolled and the percent of total referrals.
Barbara, is this real data from a school?
It is data from the demonstration account for Swiss.
Okay.
So we're looking at the second data point, and that would be the students with referrals by ethnicity. So now we're really talking about how we're going to compare the proportion of students within a racial ethnic group to the proportion of students from the same racial ethnic group who have discipline referrals. So now we're looking at what is just the piece of the referral pie only, not of the total school. The data points for this, or actually let's talk about the value first. The value in this particular data point is that it really helps us evaluate whether a certain ethnic group has a disproportionate percentage of students being referred compared to the ethnicity group's percentage of the total. So the data points for this one are that you would look at what percentage of the total population is the racial ethnic group, and then you would compare that to what percentage of the students, excuse me, what percent of the students who have referrals in this school are from this racial ethnic group. So now we're talking about students, not just referrals. So again, it will help to tell the story. And we'll follow the same data. And for this story now, when we look at different data points, there are 123 Latino students enrolled in the school. They make up 24.6% of the school's total population. But of the 337 students in the school who have a referral, 101 of them are Latino. This means that 29.97% of students in the school with referrals are Latino. So you can see that if you look at the graph on the upper left, then you can see that there's beginning to be a little bit more of a story with the overrepresentation for the Latino.
So, Barbara, two questions. I guess one's mine. So the difference between these data and the data in the previous section, is it have to do, because the other one was the composition of referrals, so it's like it's the students can have multiple referrals, so the referrals are counted more than once, versus this one it's just the number of, it's based on the number of students. Is that correct?
Yes, this one is the students, and the first one was referrals. So number of incidents, number of times that you get a referral. And this one really counts out. Right.
So there's a subset of kids who get multiple referrals, and that difference is what leads to these differences.
Right, right. And I see there's some chat going on about what do you do when you have a large percent of the population is homogeneous, is a large group of them. And that's really why we need this third data point, because then we're going to look at the risk index. And within that you can find, and I'll show you how you can find if there's still some differences in how we're treating students, minority students, even though they're the majority of the students in the school. So for this one, And you can see the comparison being that there are 255 white students enrolled in the school, and they make up 51% of the school's population. But of the 337 students who have referrals, 165 of them are white. So this means that 48.9% of the students in the school with referrals are white, so slightly underrepresented. The next data point that we want to talk about is students within each ethnicity with referrals. And this is where we're going to be talking about the referral risk index. And this is where we're going to compare the proportion of students within a racial ethnic group who have discipline referrals to the proportion of students within another racial ethnic group who have discipline referrals. So what this risk index helps us do is it is indicative of what proportion of the students in a certain racial ethnic group are at risk of receiving a referral. So just by being part of that group, do you have an increased risk of actually receiving a referral? So again, the data points here are helping us to compare those rates of referrals across groups, and it helps us identify ethnic groups that might be disproportionate. Even if you've got a majority of the students are a more homogeneous look to your population, but they are still considered minority students. When we take a look at the referral risk index, for example, in this case, there are 123 Latino students enrolled in the school. They make up 24.6% of the school's population. Of the 123 Latino students enrolled in the school, 101 of them have had a referral. This means that 82% of the school's Latino students have had a referral. So their risk index then is 0.82, or really 82%. And then look at it in comparison to the white students, where they have 225 white students enrolled, and they make up 51% of the school. But of the 225 white students enrolled in the school, only 165 of them have had a referral. This means that 64.71% of the white students have had a referral. So their risk index is 0.65, or 65%. So you can see that even though the larger population of the school is Latino, there's still a greater risk that they're going to get a referral than if we take a look at the white. Let you kind of take that in for a minute, because it didn't look like there was as much difficulty or as much disproportionality in the school, while there was some, until we did the risk ratio, the risk index. We didn't see that they're still at a much higher risk of getting a referral, even though they're the majority of the population. So this risk referral, or referral risk index, is really helping us know if there's an ethnic group that's being referred, are they all being referred at the same rate, or are there different rates of referrals? And there might be some questions about, well, where do you draw the line, and when is it important, when is something we should take a look at? And I think that's contextually something that gets decided at each and every school site. You know, is one kid too many? If there's a small difference, does it have to be statistically significant, or is it something that we're going to be making a plan for at our school so that we are truly meeting the needs of all of our students? So how you calculate this referral risk index is that you look at the number of students in a group with an office discipline referral divided by the total number of students enrolled in that group. So that's how you calculate the number. And then the value of that is it really helps you evaluate if a particular group is at a higher risk of receiving referrals than another group in the school.
We have one question, Barbara. Do you have a simple process for determining whether the percentages are statistically significant, I guess, or significantly different from each other, or is that like too techy?
Well, I don't know that it's too techy, because I think it's certainly a really good question. No, I do not have a simple process, and it's a little bit what I was alluding to a moment ago, in that you might only have a 6 or 10 or 12-point difference in your school, But if you remember back at the very beginning, we talked about how any difference starts to break down the relationship of the minority group in the school. So I don't know that there's a number that if you keep it at a certain ratio or a certain discrepancy of disproportionality that it's okay and that it won't cause more difficulties in your school. We've always approached it as we're working on this for school climate, and we don't want any disproportionality.
I see. Can you turn back to the slide once again, the risk slide? So I guess here's my question. To me, these rates of referral look really high. I mean, is this typical? This is where my ignorance comes in. I mean, 82%. I mean, that seems like a very high rate of referral. Even 40% or 48% for the Asian group, to me, seems like a pretty high rate of referral.
Yes, I agree.
I agree. So I guess if I was looking at these data, I mean, beyond the disproportionality, I mean, there's a lot of referrals.
Really need some school-wide PBIS involved.
This is baseline data, right?
Right. They could really use some school-wide. Yeah, that would be telling that 80% of your one ethnic group has a chance of getting a referral.
Right, and this doesn't account for the group of students who have multiple referrals. This is just whether they have one.
Right, whether they've gotten one.
So, which leads us to a question. So we have if you're looking at the chat area, I'm wondering if you can tell if certain students are getting all of the referrals. So if Latino kids get 5 referrals each, I treat this differently than 2 Latino kids get 25 each. Right,
and that's those first ones that we looked at. One was looking at number of referrals, and the other one was looking at number of students. So that's why we're talking about needing to have this 3-point perspective so that you can tell the difference, because your plan is going to be really differently, whether you're looking at something school-wide or if it's something that's specific that needs to help a few students feel that the school is a good place for them as well. So in this 3-point perspective, we're really looking to see the percentage of enrolled students compared to the percentage of office discipline referrals received by each of those racial or ethnic groups. So this is getting to that question that was just asked about, and you're wondering if you can tell if certain kids are getting all of the referrals. You would make sure you were looking at your data that way, making sure that you're taking a look at percentage of enrolled students. And this is really letting you know the piece of the whole pie that ethnic group has. And then the next one that we're talking about in that 3-point perspective is that the number 2 there is percentage of all enrolled students compared to the percentage of students from each group with referrals. So now we're looking at just that piece of the referral pie. How is it going for just those kids that get referrals? And then the final one is, are the ethnic groups being referred at the same rate? So this is where we're trying to see the percentage of students within each racial ethnic group that actually have referrals. So this is your risk of getting a referral just because you're part of that ethnicity group. So here's a picture of that 3-point perspective, and you can see the graphs. Just give you a quick visual, and then there's the story right next to it so that we don't lose what the visual is about. So together these graphs will really provide us with a comprehensive picture describing the extent of the proportionality or disproportionality of school referrals at any given time during the school year. So I know when I take a look at these, it really helps that once I pull up the charts that I make the little story with it, at least with one of the ethnic groups, so I don't lose track of what it is that it's measuring. And then from that is where we might be able to break this down into deciding how we could do some improvement on our practices when we're working with kids, because it gives us something to work with, not just a sense. Like now we know that 82.11% of the school's Latino students have had a referral, and while only 64% of the school's white students have had a referral. So that's definitely disproportionate.
Only 65% of white students.
Yeah, really.
So,
more than half the kids are getting in trouble here.
So I guess here I'm sort of going back to Lori's question again. I imagine there. I mean, you can slice and dice these data in many different ways, like showing sort of the percentage, the referral rates for those kids who have, say, 4 or more referrals.
Right.
You know, to get a sense of. I guess because I'm looking at sort of referrals by ethnicity, which is that gives you sort of the number of incidences. And then we get this other thing, students with referrals by ethnicity, the second sort of way of displaying the data. And to me, I'm having a hard time seeing how the kids with multiple referrals are sort of, you know, looking at that sort of type of data to see those kids. I kind of have to squint my eyes.
Yeah, right. So here we're looking at these differences in ethnicity. What you're talking about, I think, is that now we want to go back and have all of these kids that have referrals who has 5 or more or 6 or more. This school has a lot of referrals, so the data is rich so that we have a lot to work with when we're training. But so they have multiple referrals, and then answering that question, pull it up by ethnicity, and then say, so for all Latino students, how many of those students have 5 or more referrals? That's a whole different issue now that you're talking about. Then you're looking at a subgroup, right? These are really just taking a look at disproportionality.
Right. No, that's perfect. That's exactly that's sort of a different step.
Right. Right. Yes, it's a good point that you pointed out that this school needs help. It's fairly chaotic. And we don't even know what those referrals are for, actually. So that's the next step. Right. This is just letting us know we have a problem. We cannot do any solution planning from this at all. We don't have enough information to do any kind of solution development or any kind of planning from it. So this is where we would go into what we talked about last time we met and looking at our data so that we can drill down and find out what we might be able to do this. From this point, we know from looking at our ethnicity reports that we have a problem. But we need to take the next step and realize that these problem situations are always contextual. So we've got to find out now what this data means at our particular school. And we learned, or we talked about last time, that the best way to address these school-wide issues, we really have to know the context within which they exist. We have to know those critical WH questions, that where, when, what, who, and why kinds of questions. So once we identify a racial or ethnic group that we suspect that there's some disproportionality with, then we need to drill down that information with those WH questions so that we can identify the context within which those situations are existing.
Is a really good question. Do you want me to interrupt you?
Yes, go right ahead.
From Leora, I'm wondering about tracking data per adult referee versus student referral. It is vital. It is vital to track by teachers so that leadership can address disproportionality in the classroom and support teachers' approach to behavior, which is it's a whole different thing. But that's related to context, like where you're going as well.
Right. It's really related to context, and that might be something that you find out when you ask this who, what, when, where, and why question. So we want to first put it within all of the context and see if that is it. We might find out when we do this that all the referrals are coming from 3 teachers or from one wing, or only happening during a time that a certain person is out in the yard with the kids, or we don't know that until we ask these WH questions. Yeah, so you definitely want to take a look at and see if it's also where the referrals are coming from. That could be one of your critical questions. So,
right. It's an empirical
and that
question.
That is something that we work a lot with our teams and PBIS schools to help them realize that we're collecting this data for action planning, for problem solving, to monitor how well our interventions are doing, and not so much to monitor each other. So that pulling data by teacher is always tricky, and we need to be really careful with it. And I think something that belongs in the hands of the administrators, so that we don't have people not or are afraid to give us data because of what the ramifications might be. So that, yeah, I think you have to be careful with collecting. You need to look at it, but I think someone said that that's something that is for the administration. So, and then it could come up, and if it comes up in this WH process, and this is a practice that we always have, it does tend to also make that less threatening, that, oh, it's not about me. We did this, for example, with a high school. I know you guys are all middle school, but I was with a high school, and we did the same process, and we pulled up the WH questions, and it was the assistant principal that said, oh my gosh, that's me. And I think if we had come at it because of him and pulled that up first, he wouldn't have had that relation. He would have been a little bit more defensive, and I'm not able to see his part in it, because he certainly didn't think he had a part in it at all. But looking at the data, he was able to say, you know what, I must be doing something different, because I'm definitely, his part was on the consequence end, that he was, his consequences were disproportionate by ethnicity. So we also looked at it just by consequence, not just by referring teacher. So again, that's contextual, so it's whatever you tend to look at. So once you've started to take a look at this, one way to proceed is that you might say, let's identify different grade levels and see if there's something in different grade levels. This particular school that we use for the demonstration account is a K-8 school. So we've got multiple grade levels, and we decided to let's take a look and see if anything looked different when we took a look at grade levels. So when we did that, we'll talk about the 7th graders, because that's who's on the line. But we found that they had issues if we took a look at 7th, 4th, and 3rd grade. That was where the disproportionality was the strongest. Let's see, there's one more with the Y. There we go. And so we went after those 3 grade levels and asked those questions: the who, the when, the what, the where, and the why. And answered them just strictly with data to see what our answers were. So this is a little bit hard to read here, but it was how we organized our data to be able to see what was going on. So what we found is that our 7th grade students were really experiencing issues in the afternoon, and that is related to inappropriate language. We found that the issues were in the classroom and in the common areas. And when we dug a little deeper and used what we already knew about the 7th grade schedule, we realized it is related to transition times and is maintained by avoiding tasks and getting adult attention. So we felt that we had something now to work with in 7th grade. We also have the same type of idea with a story for our 4th grade. I think the next slide has the story. No, this is what I just read to you about the 7th graders. So we know that our Latino student population is at a higher risk for receiving a referral. And the Latino students most likely to receive referrals were in 3rd, 4th, and 7th grades. So we really needed to divide the context for that. And the question I say is, how do we figure out the why? That's part of the referral process when you're working with a PBIS school, is underlying principles for PBIS is behavioral science. And part of what we are helping our teachers do is to better be able to make a pretty good educated guess on if a student is trying to gain or if they're trying to avoid. And that is something that goes on the referral whenever it's sent to the office. So they're making their best guess there on the motivation or the why behind the student's misbehavior. And most of that they're able to determine.
Okay. No. I'm sorry. Keep going.
I was just going to say.
Well, I guess my question is so that is in the data. That is something that's recorded in the data. It's an empirical question, right. The why. Right. But it's based on sort of interpretations.
Right. It's and training, so they can make a better educated guess, but an understanding that if the student repeats the behavior, whatever happens immediately after that is a maintaining consequence. So you're trying to decide if they're really doing that in order to get out of work because they're allowed to escape it when they, throw a chair across the room, or if they are trying to throw the chair across the room because they're going to get the teacher support, the teacher help, the teacher's going to get involved with them. So that's kind of a simple idea behind it, but it's determining the why, because unless we really understand or take a best guess about why a student is doing that, then our plan won't match the student's need, and we have a less chance of it being successful. So we have our 3 groups, and these are our 3 stories. I think for time, we'll just talk about that 7th grade story, and that's what I just read to you, that the 7th grade Latino students are likely to receive referrals from midday on, and those referrals are coming from the classroom and transition locations, and it's because they have inappropriate language. And they are related to getting adult attention and avoiding tasks. So with this information now, we've got a better chance of trying to come up with changes in our practices that might help those students reduce that number of referrals, because we've got a specific idea of what it is that they're getting in trouble for. And last time that we met, we talked about once we've drilled down and figured this out, then we move into how do we do the solution development and the action planning phase of this. So when you're talking about trying to address disproportionality and get into the solution development, we really understand that factors related to disproportionality are really complex and they are unique. So this 3-point approach to looking at the data and drilling down with the WH questions are just a piece of what we're trying to do when we're approaching looking at disproportionality in our schools. But it does give us something, that a starting point, a place that we can look at, that we can be able to step back and take a look at ourselves and see what role that we might be playing in creating this disproportionality. It really helps us to focus on the context, and that will then aid us in developing some effective solutions and action plans. So we're not focusing on each other, we're not looking at it personally, we're really taking the behavior within the context so that we've got a better chance of taking a real look at the issue. And again, that there is really no one-size-fits-all approach to fix disproportionality. This is just a beginning at taking a look at that. And so when a team gets together and they've pulled this data and they've got those 3 stories for the 3rd, 4th, and the 7th graders, we really want to make sure that are the right people at the meeting. So if we're talking about 7th graders, are there 7th grade teachers in the room? Are the 7th grade teachers that are in that area in the room? So the people that represent the data, so we'd want to make sure is part of the meeting. And if those behaviors are being maintained by task avoidance, what is the task that they might be avoiding? Because remember, for the 7th graders, we said it was task avoidance and getting adult attention. So what happens right after that period? What is it that they're all going to? And is it a behavior issue or is it more of an academic issue? We might also be asking ourselves, what is it that we know about the school's daily schedule that can help us design effective solutions around that problem? So again, because it's so contextual, knowing about our own schools is really important. This isn't something an outsider can come and solve for us. We need to make sure that the right people are in the room that are working on the issue. We might also be taking a look at what systems are in place to support the staff behavior. So what are we thinking about that we can help our kids? If we've got a staff that's dealing with a very ethnically diverse population, are we giving them the teaching strategies and the skills that they need in order to be able to teach the different ethnic groups in our school and do that with some level of respect to their cultures? Do we have a strong school-wide system, and is our school-wide system fair? Is it consistent? Is it predictable? So how are we doing with our Tier 1 types of interventions? And then what practices are in place really to support that student behavior? If we're trying to teach them a new skill set, what are we doing to help them learn that new skill set, particularly if it's different from what their culture is that they experience in their own homes? So I see that someone's talking about that you've implemented those student listening circles, and it helps answer the why and help staff listens without comment. All those kinds of things are what you would want to be talking about in the meeting do we have this kind of support for our teachers so they can effectively use these listening circles as just one of the many ideas. It's also good that you would want to set up a measurable goal to help us analyze, monitor, and adjust that professional practice. That was that last question on our poll, that we've come up with a solution plan, but have we also figured out a way that we're going to monitor if that solution plan is really working or not. So if it was a lot of noise that we noticed that was happening in those 7th graders when they were transitioning back into class, maybe if we take a look at reducing the noise level, would that also help? So here's our 3 stories again. The last one we were talking about is the 7th grade Latino students. And what we'd want to do is overlay that into that solution development plan and talk about with that story with our 7th graders, what might we do to prevent it? How can we avoid that whole problem context from happening? Then looking at how would we teach? What is it that we want to teach now that we have a clear understanding of what the problem is? How are we going to recognize the students for doing the new behaviors we want them to have? How are we going to make sure the old behaviors don't work for them? And then what would be our efficient consequences for when the misbehavior does happen? And how are we going to collect data to see how we're doing with our plans that we put into place? So when we take a look at trying to address the disproportionality at our schools, we first have to find out if we have a problem. And then just what is that problem? That's where we're talking about that 3-point data look at disproportionality. And then within that, can we lead ourselves to making a good precision statement so we can begin to develop a solution plan and then monitor to see if that solution plan is working?
You know, Barbara, we're getting some questions. This issue of what if there's no heterogeneity in the school with regards to race, ethnicity, and are there other types of disproportionality that folks look at? You know, including EL status, language proficiency status, free reduced poverty status, things like that.
I'm sure that there are, and I don't want to talk beyond the scope of what today is, but
right.
looking at the ethnicity, that there's disproportionality in special education referrals, but that again is related to ethnicity. And I don't know if anyone has just pulled out the free and reduced lunch by itself, because the data, maybe somebody out there will know better than I. I'm not going to be able to quote the studies, but the free and reduced lunch doesn't come out to show the disproportionality by itself. I think that's part of why this is all so complex. It all plays off of each other. And you have to look at them on it. So I really don't have an answer to that, if people would do that, or if they're just looking at the ethnicity. Because in a heterogeneous mix, that's really where you're going to have a better chance of finding the disproportionality. Then again, in the real homogeneous, like we've got lots of schools that are 89, 90, 95% Hispanic. But when you do that 3-point, you'll still be able to see that within that, the white kids will have less of a chance of getting a referral. And we're not even talking about the African American, because that just wasn't part of this one. That in our state, it's the African American males that are over-referred. And that looks different by grade levels, too. Okay. Well, it does look like we're out of time. It's 4:30. Barbara, I want to thank you so much. This is a great presentation. It's extremely useful. There's a couple questions we didn't get to, and I'm sorry about that.